evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar tonight. Tonight is our 45th webinar. Would you believe it? 45 webinars we've been doing. And next month we'll literally celebrate our first birthday of doing Social Work Student Connect webinars. So I've been trying to work out exactly when our first one was, but we've done 45 sessions so far. Tonight we have a fabulous guest webinar, which means that I can sit back and learn and the team can sit back and learn, and we're all very much looking forward to tonight's webinar, which is all about co-production at the kitchen table, and it's going to be led by guests from Social Work Voices at the University of Suffolk. So at this point I'm going to hand over now to our fabulous guests. So we're joined by John and Sarah and Sophie. I'm going to hand over for the night and I'm going to sit back and learn. I know this is going to be a fabulous session. I don't even have to screen share tonight, which is really unusual for me. So I'm really looking forward to tonight. Thank you ever so much to our guests. And I'm going to hand over at this point. If anybody has any tech issues, just put them into the Q&A and then we'll be able to pick them up. And if you've got any questions for our guests as the session goes along, pop those into the Q&A as well, and that would be fabulous. So I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to hand over to John and Sarah and Sophie, if that's okay with you.
Hello.
Okay. Co-production at the kitchen table. So as the title of this webinar probably suggests, we're going to talk to you about co-production and specifically about how to put the theory of co-production into practice. As we go through this webinar, as you're already doing a little bit, it might be helpful to think about how you might apply some of these principles on placement at university or in your workplace.
Firstly, why is co-production important? Co-production enables social workers to find positive relationships with those that they are working alongside. It is an approach that can ease feelings of mistrust. Working within the ethos of co-production creates more effective outcomes, and it is a more holistic way of working. Professionals may also find that it is a more rewarding method of practicing. Co-production allows for the breakdown of barriers and gives professionals the opportunity to really make a lasting impact on people's lives.
So how are we going to go about this? There are going to be questions. We're going to ask you questions and you're going to have the opportunity to ask us questions. There are also going to be some great stories tonight, and we're absolutely honoured to have John and Sarah with us sharing their stories. We're going to give you some ideas about co-production, the sort of things that are working for us. And we're going to talk a little bit about the barriers and the enablers. And if you see us reading off the slide, that is purely for accessibility purposes.
I'm going to just briefly explain the terms that we're going to use throughout the webinar. Social Work Voices is a group of people with a really diverse range of lived experience who work with the staff at the University of Suffolk and the Suffolk County Council to impact really every aspect of a social worker's education. We've had so many debates over the term service user, and we all agreed that service participant fitted much more with our ethos. It's a much more inclusive term, and for myself, having been cared for, if I don't participate, you can't care for me. It's as simple as that. If I don't open my mouth, you can't put a spoon into it. We wanted to avoid all the negative connotations that people have always felt were sort of surrounding the term service user. So we want to remind people with the term service participant that we want to be active participants in decision making, especially in light of resources available, and we want to form full and equal partnerships with the professionals involved in our care all the time.
So I'm going to introduce myself, and I'll just say that most of what I'm going to say today I've scripted, but I'm going to try and ad-lib every now and again in the spirit of authenticity. And hopefully I'll just be able to get across how I come to be talking to you today, and also why the subject of co-production resonates so much with me. So on script, my name's John Salar. After witnessing the death of my mother and unborn sister at the hands of my mentally ill father at the age of 2, I was put into foster care, where I remained for the next 16 years. I was found under a blanket by a police officer and put into a home for 3 months, and then I was placed in 4 different homes. And I settled in the last one from the age of 6 to 18, and managing to maintain, well, my father managed to maintain a consistent relationship with me. I fell in love at 17 years old and began to feel psychologically overwhelmed, having had no support in processing what I'd witnessed as an infant or consequently endured in the aftermath. I was misdiagnosed with a chronic mental illness and hospitalised in an adult psychiatric ward in the early 90s. I had 3 subsequent hospitalisations and lived under a false diagnosis, taking prescribed drugs for approximately the next 20 to 25 years, with still no professional psychological assistance. I eventually sought out private psychotherapy and began to realise that I probably had been affected with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and some fairly significant developmental issues, having had no matriarchal figure from the age of 2 onwards. I've worked as a youth support worker and teaching assistant in the theatre, schools, colleges, youth clubs, pupil referral units, internal exclusion rooms and universities. I'm a second-year counselling student, an artist and songwriter, professional musician, stepfather and husband. And incidentally, having divorced from my first wife some time back, I married the aforementioned first love in 2018, after she looked me up in 2016, having ignored me for 27 years. And I've been working with social work students for the past 6 years.
I love that story. It's great. Hi, I'm Sarah Barker, and I suppose my best introduction would just be to tell you my story in brief, because hopefully it will add a bit of context to why I'm here. I'm a mad keen gardener and an enthusiastic dance student, if not very skillful, but yeah, enthusiastic anyway. And I'm a mum of 3 young adults. Isaac is my eldest, he's 28, and my youngest daughter is 21. It's a pretty busy household with us all in it together, and Isaac has 2-to-1 24-hour live-in care, so we're all piled in together. I left school at 15, couldn't bear the whole system of education, although I waited and did my O-levels before I left. But I joined a travelling circus the day after my last exam. Had lots of different jobs in between then and when Isaac was born, mostly in youth work, knife crime prevention, domestic violence, advocacy, all sorts. My working life really took a back seat when Isaac was born. I was really convinced that he was unwell very, very shortly after his birth. Unfortunately, I wasn't believed. I was considered to be a neurotic first-time mum, and it took a long time and a lot of professionals before I got taken seriously. At that point, we spent the best part of the first few years in Great Ormond Street, mostly, amongst other hospitals, with sort of tests and scans and surgery, all sorts. It was a pretty kind of isolated and surreal experience, to be honest. Isaac is non-verbal. He has profound learning and physical disabilities. He has seizures, sometimes loads, and he stops breathing and needs resuscitation, sometimes several times in a 24-hour period. When Isaac was 6, I had my second child, and a year later my third, my daughter. My second son became really ill at 2.5. He was in a coma and in intensive care for 2 weeks, and I was told that he wouldn't make it. He did, and he was diagnosed with viral meningitis. A year later, the same thing occurred, and a year after that. And both times he was diagnosed with viral meningitis. I began to read research papers after a consultant looking after him said, we don't think that if this happens again that we're going to be able to save his life. We have no clue what's going on, completely at a loss. So I kind of learned this new weird medical language so that I could actually understand the research that I was reading. Bought myself a medical dictionary and read piles and piles and piles of research, and eventually made a couple of links in my brain and found a research scientist in San Francisco. I phoned him up at 2 o'clock in the morning, my 2 o'clock in the morning, not his, and got this guy on the phone. And within a few weeks, he had a diagnosis for my second son. He flew to Great Ormond Street to make sure that Isaac didn't have the same condition. And it was discovered that my second son, had a very, very rare medical condition. In fact, so rare that at age 5, he was the only survivor in Europe. He now at 22 is one of only less than a handful of survivors in Europe. So there are so many stories between that point and this, and some really scary times when one or other, or both at the same time, boys nearly died. So I fought a lot of battles on their behalf and on the behalf of my daughter, who really, really struggled with anxiety with everything that was going on in our household. And particularly when I, as a single mum, was diagnosed with cancer and needed major surgery and chemo and more major surgery and more chemo, etc. And needed care myself for a while. So I'm still here to tell all the stories. My boys are alive despite the odds against them, and my daughter is becoming the strong young woman that she was destined to be. Life hasn't been very easy, I wouldn't say, but it is a privilege. I wake up every morning to the sound of Isaac laughing. All my kids have got really busy, happy lives, and I think as a family we've experienced the very best of what professionals have to offer, and unfortunately the very worst at times. So the reason I'm here is that I came from a place where my voice wasn't heard, and often felt like I was just banging my head against a brick wall, to be honest. And I've been telling my family stories for over 20 years because I really want other service participants' voices to be heard. I started, I think, with a epilepsy training when my son was about 5. I attended a training session that was very negative, and I wanted to give a much more pragmatic and positive view of epilepsy and the carers that had to look after people having seizures. Lived experience in social work has been really a major part of that, telling my stories, and I've been with Ipswich University for much of that time. Service participants like me have really found our voices at the University of Suffolk and in Social Work Voices.
Thank you, Sarah and John. So my name's Sophie Walters, and I'm the Citizen Involvement Coordinator for the University of Suffolk and Suffolk County Council. And my role is to work alongside Social Work Voices, the group that Sarah's already described, who work across both organisations. And I believe we've got some of Social Work Voices in tonight. We've got about 17 members, and we've got people with direct experience of services, and we've got people who are carers and people who have experience of both. and they're an amazing group. They are absolutely committed to changing social work education for the better, and it's a total privilege to work alongside them. My background, I have previous experience of working in complex need homelessness hostels, NHS mental health services and student support. And the aim of my role currently is to ensure that the social worker, whether as a student or a qualified professional, never loses sight of the person they're working with, and that that person's views and experiences are always at the heart of the work. So tonight, as we go through things, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. To be honest, we'll probably come to them at the end, but we'd love to see them in there. If something doesn't make sense, if you want us to go deeper into one of the stories, let us know. John and Sarah have very generously said that it's a kind of no holds barred kind of approach tonight, and we're very grateful for them to that. We'll be talking about our experiences, and we'll be taking turns in order to do so. We'll be reading a little bit because we can't remember everything. And as John put it the other day, we are very much trying to keep this real in possibly one of the most unreal situations possible. So we acknowledge that co-production for some people is just another word, or at worst, a justification for doing less. But we've found it massively helpful in our work together, and we've come to talk to you about how we found it helpful tonight. We're going to use the Co-Production Network for Wales definition and model of co-production. So we're going to go through the definition first, and then we're going to go through each of these 5 principles. So the principles will be the text that you see on the slide, and then we'll give you our thoughts about each one, and then we'll give you some ideas about how you can put those principles into practice. So the definition of co-production is that co-production is an asset-based approach to public services that enables people providing and people receiving services to share power and responsibility and work together in equal, reciprocal and caring relationships. It creates opportunities for people to access support when they need it and contribute to social change. So, in a nutshell, co-production is about sharing power. It is about creating equal and mutually beneficial relationships built on people's strengths. And it is not true co-production unless something changes. It's not a panacea, and we appreciate it's probably more difficult to do with children.
I was quite blown away when I first came across this concept of co-production. Firstly by its simplicity, but just by its the broadness of it. From my opinion, it can be a macrocosmic and microcosmic thing, in that on one side it's a societal idea about communities, and then it can be approached to institutions and organizations, and service participants, and also an individual, a personal life. I focus mainly on thinking in terms of working within an institutional organisation co-productively, but this is what I scripted. An encompassing collaboration and camaraderie underpinned by mutual respect and ultimately compassion. I believe that the coining of the concept of co-production regarding community cohesion and unification is both archaic and refreshing in its acknowledgement of what it truly means to be human beings in relationship, working together in harmony for the good of all. This concept has been explained many times over the years by a variety of cultures, with such cliches as "it takes a village to raise a child" and "all for one and one for all," and in the more recent popularization of the African word Ubuntu, which is, I believe, has been adopted by some in the field of social work, and in my opinion can easily be appropriated to the ethos of community co-production. As the offspring of a West Indian immigrant and a primary school teacher raised in foster homes, I grew up under the influence of mainly left-wing political ideals. For many years, I lived in one of the most ethnically diverse areas of North London, perhaps in Europe, which had become synonymous with knife crime and labelled Shanktown by an unnamed tabloid newspaper. Our town was mostly a harmonious environment with a strong village mentality in which we lived, worked and played together side by side, integrating our vast cultural differences. There were pillars of the community in our town who were open, fair empathic and broad-minded enough to generate and nurture our unique community spirit. My mostly left-wing disappointment at what I often perceived as governmental apathy for the underprivileged has been eased by this concept of co-production, because for me it clearly provides a framework from which communities can be more self-sufficient and less dependent on the hope of interventions from governments who, in my opinion, usually prioritise a different demographic, and thus potentially initially receiving backing and support from the political and financial elite.
So co-production's got to be based on a foundation of reciprocal relationships and mutual trust. Placing real value on people's lived experiences is vital, really. To do this, we must challenge old concepts belonging to both professionals and service participants. We've got to build co-productive relationships really carefully to do that. We might need to leave behind historic structures and processes and become maybe a bit more creative, as service participants quite often bring their bad experiences to the table, as well as their good, obviously. We're going to leave behind attitudes of I know best or us and them. We're all done with those. And professionals need to see this as an opportunity for really positive change, because we are all heading towards an environment that creates mutual trust and opens the way to potential for more positive outcomes for service participants.
So co-production highlights that no one person is more important than another. So just because I hold a professional role within the organisation does not mean that my views or opinions carry any more sway than any other member of Social Work Voices, and it is important that I always remember this. At times, my role may mean that I hold more power, and in those instances, I must always make sure that I use my power in the best interests of those that I am working alongside, and that I am following collaborative decisions that have been made. I must share this power wherever possible.
For co-production to be effective and achieve its far-reaching potential, those involved must find their involvement personally and collectively empowering and influential. They must be aware that their contribution is respected and valued, that their input is integral and equal to that of all others, those with similar and also different skills, backgrounds and opinions.
Collaboration is absolutely fundamental to this approach. We're in it together in equal parts. Co-production must not be tokenistic. It's also not a passing the buck exercise, as some skeptics would see it. Some service participants may still want to hand the problem over and say, here you go, you deal with it. Some professionals may see it as a way of relinquishing a little bit of responsibility, maybe lightening their load. Neither is going to work. We're going to have to work it out between us.
Collaboration is the action of working together and is the basis of everything we try and do at Social Work Voices. Group members are involved in designing, facilitating and evaluating the sessions that they deliver. This avoids tokenistic involvement, re-centres real-life concerns that the members are bringing, and is an approach which is highly valued by students.
Professionals must prioritise co-production at every step, go into every situation aiming for it. Service participants don't want lip service, it's got to be visceral. It needs a really deep understanding of co-production from professionals. And they're going to have to be able to relate to people and be empathic and boundaried. And there's going to be a pastoral element to the work. They have a responsibility to be sensitive and avoid assumption and bias. Easily said, I know. Service participants in a safe space, particularly, are going to tell the professionals the stuff they don't want to hear. And during these times of reduced advocacy, we have to be mindful that we may all need to take that role more and more. And just to illustrate, I'm going to tell you a little story. I've got a friend with a disabled son, and she turned up at my house one day in some distress. When I say some, that's a great underestimation. She and I were sitting in my garden, smoking cigarettes and cursing like sailors, when my son's social worker arrived. I offered him a cup of tea, and he responded by saying, I can see you've probably got stuff to unload, so how about I make the tea? He left aside the discussion that he had planned with me that day, and he sat down and he engaged with me and my friend and her issue. My friend told me recently that of all the social workers in all the years that have been involved with her son and his care, my son's social worker who made us tea that day is the only one whose name she remembers. Service participants and carers in particular often really feel powerless and unheard, and I'm afraid often with good reason. We all have a joint responsibility to really hear each other's voices. Everyone has something valuable to say. My son is often treated as an invisible entity because he is non-verbal. He's got a lot to say and he's got a lot to teach us. In empowering the service participant, we prioritise the safety and protection of those receiving care rather than the protection and of the institution. It's really important to remember that.
As Sarah's story demonstrates, you must meet someone where they are at on any given day. Despite the title of this webinar, we appreciate that not everyone has a kitchen table. You might be meeting someone on a pavement, a park bench, or in a hostel, but it's important to check out how that person is doing, just as you would with one of your colleagues. You may have to adjust your expectations as to what can be achieved in a session if someone is having a bad day, or equally, increase those expectations and run with it if someone is having a really good day. It is about being led by the person involved.
Yeah, meet us on our bad days. There was a time a social worker arrived at my house one day to do an assessment on my son Isaac. Isaac was in his bedroom, and as the social worker entered the room and began to introduce himself, Isaac went into a fairly major seizure. Isaac's carer and I got Isaac onto the bed, and Isaac was jerking and retching and going blue in the face. It's fairly normal stuff. And I told the social worker not to worry, take a seat. Isaac's seizures are often, but they don't usually last more than a few minutes. A couple of minutes in, my other son came into the room shouting, "Mum, I'm having a crisis," by which he meant a dreamer crisis, which is part of his condition, and he promptly collapsed on the floor unconscious. Probably, in all likelihood, at the same time, my daughter was shouting from the other room, "Mum, where's my socks?" or "the washing machine's leaking," or something. It's complete chaos in my household sometimes. Anyway, I forgot that this poor guy was sitting in the corner and my son on the floor, and I pulled my son's tracksuit bottoms down and injected him with steroids in the backside, which is what we do when he has a crisis. I then turned to Isaac on the bed and gave seizure medication. 20 minutes later, both boys fully recovered. Unfortunately, the poor social worker had fled, never to be seen again. Well, not by me anyway. Had I actually got his name, he probably gave it to me, but obviously it wasn't the time for me to be listening. I'd have rung him and said, "It's really not always that bad," or at least not more than half an hour of every day in my house. It's pretty chaotic, but you know, we coped.
Build relationships of trust, share power and responsibility. An environment of co-production must be a safe environment, stemming from relationships of trust. There must be space for open dialogue and negotiation for all participants so that power can be evenly distributed.
Without this first step, every other part of co-production becomes impossible. Without mutual trust, things will become very difficult. It is my role as a professional to find as many ways as possible of minimising the inherent power imbalances that exist.
I guess to trust feels like a risk sometimes, and most of us really enjoy our autonomy. My son a while back needed really major surgery, and I took him to see the surgeon, and as we walked through the door, my son, as he does, stopped breathing. The surgeon completely freaked out and said, "No way, absolutely not. I'm never going to operate on him. I am not going to have him die on my table." I explained that actually my son only stops breathing when he's awake. But the surgeon wasn't convinced at all. And he said, "I am not doing it. You have to trust my judgment." And I said, "No, actually, I'm sorry, but you have to trust mine." He said, "I'm the expert in this surgery." And I said, "I'm the expert in my son." To cut a really long story short, my son had his surgery, and not because I won an argument, but because the surgeon and I came to a place where we actually trusted each other, and we took joint responsibility for the risks ahead. Co-production can't work without trust and support of each other. Trust is sometimes hard to achieve. Responsibility, probably easier to share, particularly when things are going well. Much harder to admit that, yep, I played a part in that when things go tits up. Service participants often can feel done to, in inverted commas. Many speak of feeling powerless or unheard. Service providers are quite often used to holding the power and responsibility, but there is a shift. There really is a shift. Co-productive working at the University of Suffolk within the social work faculty and social work voices is showing the benefits of shared power and responsibility. We are really reaping the rewards when students speak of impactful learning, when they speak of taking co-production out into practice, and when faculty, professionals, students and those with lived experience take joint responsibility to create a place where all voices are equal and there's a real feeling of sharing of trust and power.
Often sharing power is made difficult by hierarchical institutional structures, and it is your role as a professional to challenge and alter these as much as possible. As a university and as a council, we try to model relationships as they should be, and we endeavour to ensure that this is done throughout the work. An example would be having members with lived experience involved in meetings across all levels of the social work course. This means that they can be involved in a way where their opinions are heard, respected and acted upon.
Participants' core values are the foundation of co-production. Co-production cannot be authentic within a power play paradigm, whether it is overt or covert. This can be problematic as power struggles are not always identifiable and not easy to address without compromising the ethos of co-production. A good starting point, in my opinion, is to ensure as much as possible that the professionals involved in co-production have core values that are conducive to working in a spirit of mutual respect and equality. I believe that this potential stumbling block must generally be avoided as much as possible at the recruitment stage. In my work assessing social work candidates for admittance, my assessment of their core values has been perhaps the most important aspect. because elitist core values are not easily altered, deepened or broadened solely by good education, and such candidates may serve better in different fields of occupation. In all of my encounters with people, professionally and personally, I endeavour to interact from the indomitable working awareness that I at least have as much to learn from them as they have from me, with as little prejudice as possible. It's not always easy, but I always try to do that.
So we're going to build relationships of trust. We're going to share power and we're going to share responsibility. And we're going to do that by allowing family members to really participate in creating the best possible outcomes for their carees or their loved ones. We're going to be prepared to set aside agendas and engage in issues that we hadn't anticipated. You know, there's always going to be something that flies past that you weren't expecting. Being honest about what's possible and what isn't is really important. Don't give service participants a list of resources that are available only to find a little way down the road that maybe they don't meet the criteria or there's not funding available. If you don't know, that's fine, say so. It's good to say it. None of us know it all. We're going to be courageous, brave, and because it is a risk to trust other people and hand over something that you hold dear, like your responsibility or your you know, your power. So be brave.
Value all participants and build on their strengths. So I got a little bit on my soapbox with this one. When we are able to enter into working relationships without bias and with open minds, then logic dictates that we have more resources to draw on, providing a wider variety of options from which to progress. This is how a group of diverse individuals with equal say and effectively working as one becomes a very powerful collective. I was delighted to find this 50p piece with the inscription "Diversity Built Britain" on it recently. Due to my cultural heritage, which mostly stems from African slaves and English slave owners, I immediately related this statement to the use of African slaves to build much of our country's infrastructure and to strengthen our economy. We're obviously now aware that the use of slaves is inhumane, but this is still a very stark example of the use of diversity, particularly because this questionable aspect of our history has now led us to the opportunity to respectfully benefit from our massively rich, diverse cultural environment. Another very stark example of our society benefiting from listening to the concerns of a marginalised group was the Suffragette Movement.
And I'm glad that you found a picture of the 50p without the Queen's head on it. Much as I like the Queen, she is a symbol of a hierarchical society. So we're learning as we teach, we're teaching as we learn. It sounds really cheesy, but it's a really asset-based approach. And we're placing value on what every individual has to offer, and it's going to be different for every person. My lived experiences are a valuable tool and have real impact in teaching, as are other people's. I do a lot of role play and scenarios in social work education, and bringing other people's voices to that is a big part of that. My students and faculty are invited to feel it with me.
Every human being has a unique perspective and life experience. Everybody knows something that the next person doesn't. So if we're open-minded enough to listen, consider and work with this unlimited wealth of feelings, thoughts and experiences, then anything could be possible. The adversity that I endured as a child in foster care and a traumatized adult has always set me apart as some sort of outcast. It's been hugely empowering to bring what I have learned from these experiences to peers and colleagues, to be valued and provide improving influence on their practice and training. Having lost my mum as a 2-year-old and my father being hospitalised, I was placed in my 4th place of residence at the age of 4. I was abused in this foster home, and although I expressed my fears and my guardian to the social services, I was kept in that home for a year. Just to add a bit more context, I've only got really 2 memories from my childhood, and then those 2 memories are instances of abuse that I experienced there. So in the spirit of giving some context and disclosure and feeling that this is a very safe environment, I'm going to share these two incidents with you. My foster mother in this placement had a baby boy, and I think he had a heart condition, and so maybe me being physically healthy, maybe that was something that she found challenging. And she was giving me a bath. I was 4 years old, and she had the baby shampoo for her son at the bath, and she went out and to wash my hair, and she told me not to use this shampoo, which of course I did because I didn't want to sting my eyes. When she came back and noticed that I'd use it, she held my head under the bath water. And another incident that I was scared to get up. Once I'd gone to bed, I was scared to get up and go to the toilet because I was afraid of her. I think she probably told me off quite severely. And once I actually did a number 2 in my bed, and she rubbed that in my face. And I stayed in this home for a year, expressing that I was scared of her, but I don't think I actually told of those particular incidents. Anyway, by the grace of God, I'm privileged to speak of this in my work with social work students, and I find it immensely healing to receive their empathic reactions. This co-productive element of my involvement in their training now increases my sense of worth and the validity of my voice, which I obviously didn't feel then.
I'm horrified every time I hear that story from John, and I've heard it before, and I'm horrified every time that his young voice wasn't heard. And if any of you take anything from today, I would like to say, hear us when we've got dementia, when we're children, when we're sleeping in a shop doorway, or when, like my son, we can't speak. Hear us. In fact, listen so well that you hear what's not being said as well as what is. That's my rant. I've always felt that if something needs changing, you need to go and do something about it. It's the reason I'm so committed to social work voices. I've had years of interaction with professionals, and honestly, even the bad experiences are a privilege when they can be used in teaching and a learning experience for someone else. If you want change, you're going to have to be part of that change. As I said, and I keep saying it, I've seen the best and worst of social work practice at my kitchen table. I have got a kitchen table these days, so I'm quite proud of that. I might have a different perspective to the professionals about what represents good or bad practice. That makes it real. That's life. We're all going to have a different view, but we are all learning and can all learn all the time. If a situation hasn't been handled well, you know, that experience can hopefully be used as a learning experience for the next person who comes along to handle it better. We are assisting each other to learn.
We have some incredible examples of building on John and Sarah's strengths to achieve some amazing outcomes. For example, as Sarah's mentioned, she has a son who is non-verbal. She built a 3-hour communication session around non-verbal communication bespoke to social work, which was fantastically received by the social work students. John is passionate about counselling skills and has background in acting, and used these to create a training session about communication as a social worker, which again, the students found invaluable. We are privileged to have such a diverse range of skills and experiences within the Social Work Voices group, and it is an absolute pleasure to be a part of developing these talents. It is about focusing on what we do have and the opportunities that are available to us. And these examples just demonstrate just how much someone, even a qualified social worker, stands to learn from the people they are working with.
So we must value all participants and build their strengths by building a bond and rapport, being prepared to give something of yourself to do this, recognising and playing to the strengths of the person that we're working with, and showing an interest in someone as a person. Take the time to find out something that is not necessarily directly relevant to the work.
So just some of our ideas, some of which we've already covered. We've done the counselling skills session led by John, which was fantastic. We've had Sarah's non-verbal communication session. We've got People in Social Work Voices podcasting, which we find is a really pure way of people being able to tell their story. We've created vlogs. We've had people involved in meetings all the way up to operations and exec board. We've had people, Sarah's, we'll talk to you a little bit later about the carers session that she designed. We're co-designing resources, and both John and Sarah have been involved in online role plays as well.
Develop networks of mutual support. My work has also brought to my attention the importance of peer support. I mentioned earlier my feelings of being an outcast, having no contact with people experiencing similar levels of adversity. This increased my isolation and often led me into self-pity and sometimes apathy. To work with people with extraordinary levels of resilience and compassion with a genuine motivation to help others has been humbling and inspiring, activating me in me a sense of belonging that has long been missing throughout my life. This mutual support has proved to be fundamentally important to me.
For us all, John, we are unique. Everyone knows someone who can do the things they can't. There's a huge range of skills and attributes that we have access to, all of us. Often they are just undiscovered. Every individual has a huge network available to them. We sometimes might just have to dig a little deeper. I was preparing for a carers perspective teaching session recently, and I wanted to get a really diverse range of views. I spoke to lots of carers, and my many contacts took me to people's experiences that were powerful, painful, liberating. I met with someone who has cared for her brother for many years since his diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. He doesn't see professionals at all. And while I was gaining his sister's insight, I waved at him through a window. A couple of meetings later, he actually joined us. He overcame his suspicion of me and joined us at the table and was able to give his perspective and his thoughts and his feelings. And what he taught me is there is much that I will take forward into my teaching of students. It's like the people I meet are sometimes the really silent voices, but within social work voices, sometimes in the way of role play or written scenarios, we are bringing those silent voices to learn from.
In forming links to other organisations, people and professionals, it is important to be open and put your prejudgments to one side. These mutual networks are extremely important and have opened up a huge range of opportunities for the Social Work Voices group. One example is that if Sarah or John is running a teaching session, then I help them capture some of what they're saying and support them to shape it into a final session. We will then collaborate with one of the academics to check that the session fits with the module outcomes and the learning that the students have already done. In order to develop sessions of the standard that we have requires both support and collaboration. Co-producing together in this way has massively increased the quality of the work produced. It is about doing things with people, not about doing things to or for people. I should always be working alongside someone as an equal partner.
And I reckon we're all cogs in a machine. We connect, we function, we produce, we co-produce. And maybe sometimes it feels a bit of an unwieldy machine, I suppose. But when the cogs align, we can create and produce really insightful, impactful learning that can last throughout a whole career. So we're going to develop networks of support by linking people to lived experience groups such as Social Work Voices. We're going to signpost people to really appropriate services and social support. And by appropriate, I mean appropriate to the person that you're speaking to. Lots of times, social workers recommended that I joined a local family carer group where I could go in the morning and get my nails done and have a chat. I was a mad keen dancer, wasn't very keen on getting my nails done, but had I been able to access that, or somebody suggested it for an hour of care in an evening, then that would have given me the respite that I craved. So don't always look at what's available, look at what's needed first. Opening your mind to look at the periphery and support needed outside of the focal point of the work sometimes. You might need to know my strengths or take a broader view.
So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of my role. So some of the things I get involved in are sharing opportunities amongst the group, trying to do that as fairly as possible. And that involves knowing people's strengths and interests, knowing how they want to be involved. We have people that are involved once a year, we have people that are involved nearly every week, and it's about working with the person to work out how they want to be involved. I'm also responsible for the infrastructure, so making sure people get paid, making sure they know where to be, when they need to be there, and what they're doing when they get there. I'm responsible for promoting the group and checking in with people, which has been really vital through the pandemic. And I feel really lucky that my role is solely dedicated to those with lived experience and that I have the time to do all of these things. Do what matters for all people. It is not about fitting people to processes, but about fitting the processes to people. Always remember that people are not there to conform or fit to your processes. I think that this is something that is demonstrated quite nicely by the illustration on the slide, which for anyone who is unsure is a square peg being forced into a round hole. An example of this would be the creation of pay slips for Social Work Voices members. As previously they were unsure what they were being paid for, the system wasn't working for them. It was confusing and not very accessible, and so we came up with a workaround that made it better for them. It is about processes that best serve people.
It's not the best depiction of a square peg and a round hole, but we couldn't find a better one. My son was always the square peg. He just simply never fitted into the boxes or met the different criteria. I can't think who he takes after, but it's vital that the social worker at my kitchen table isn't simply engaged in a tick box exercise, and that they see the person instead of the form. I've often felt, as somebody sitting, filling in, ticking boxes on an assessment, that they're not really hearing what's being said. Several years ago, another story, sorry, you can tell me that I ought to shut up sometimes. Several years ago, I'd been waiting some months for a carer's assessment. Actually, there was no one in post locally at the time. And during the wait, I attended a parent and carer training day run by the local authority. It was a mix of service participants, carers and professionals. And in the afternoon, I found myself like really complaining quite loudly about the lack of assessment, and ended up in a workshop sitting next to a social worker, and he and I really clashed. We disagreed on absolutely everything. Anyway, 3 weeks later, I opened my front door to the social worker coming to do the assessment, and yep, it was him. It was a classic you've been framed moment, I think, when if you'd have taken a photograph of his face and mine. My first words were, "Sod's law, it had to be you," and he felt the same. In fact, later on, he said he thought I was terrifying. Poor man. Anyway, we were stuck with each other. We agreed we were. And he eventually said to me, "We need to work together. I really want to ensure that your family's needs are identified with you and met in the best way possible. I need your help to do my job well." It was very probably my first really co-productive relationship with a social worker. And it was built on trust entirely. I trusted him and he trusted me. And we didn't always get it right, either of us, but neither of us had all the answers. We got that. He was my son's social worker for less than 2 years, but during that time, he really set things in motion that have a positive impact on my family still today.
By modelling doing what matters for everyone involved at the University of Suffolk and Suffolk County Council, we hope that just like that social worker Sarah's just described, the students will take this on board and carry this out into practice with them.
To establish and maintain an equal distribution of power, the concerns, opinions and priorities of everybody must be addressed in a respectful, empathic manner from the basis of mutual trust. Everyone must know that they will be heard and that their contributions will be given equal consideration to those of others, regardless of any seemingly incongruousness in their opinion or the way in which they deliver it. The platform must be provided and upheld for all points of view and ranges of opinion to integrate and flourish.
So put your heart into it. It's often about giving people more unstructured opportunities for involvement and feedback, allowing them to express their concerns and their views. And it has to be unaffected by the agenda of professionals. Too formal a setting for some service participants can be really intimidating, especially for service participants new to a collaborative way of working. Flexibility is really important if we're going to create effective and supportive relationships, and people are going to be supported in a way that really suits them. The outcome is more important than the output. The difference in someone's life and how you achieve it is more important than what you did and how often and how much it cost.
Do what matters for all people by hearing my voice and act on my concerns. Entering every situation with the expectation that you're going to work with that person, even if you have to work towards this point. Valuing all voices, even those that don't fit with what you want to hear.
People can be change makers within organisations. Here we adapted the Welsh model, which initially read, "People can be change makers and organisations enable this." We felt that the wording displayed on the slide fitted better with the ethos of our organisation. We thought that people should be the organisation. Without this, the power is placed in the organisation's hands and people are only allowed to change things if the organisation lets them. The words are important in this context.
We spoke loads about change, sometimes requiring real determination and sometimes work taking a lot longer than we anticipated it would. Our expectations have to be flexible. Sometimes work even goes uncompleted. It's the nature of the beast. As service participants may come and go according to their health or their carees' health. One of the barriers for service participants is often a lack of continuity with professionals. And we really hope that a sharing of responsibility and trust and power will create, amongst other things, a better working environment for social workers, and therefore improve potential for a longer shelf life. We want to keep you. Co-production at its best should create a less stressful environment for social workers and keep you in post.
Although we should be mindful of the possible repercussions of challenging the practices of hierarchical organisations, we should be imbued with the support of our fellow trusted participants, sparking the courage of our convictions from a place of safety. I came up with this expression. I don't know if it's original, but I was quite pleased with it. Change comes from challenge, and challenge comes from courage.
And a lot of institutions and organisations need change. And change happens when you have a unification of open-minded people, a range of opinion, people able to communicate and compromise, and a safe place to challenge, to find the best way forward. Organisations and service participants have to be willing to change. Different people will have different views on what represents good or poor practice, but it's when these visions come together that positive change occurs. And in order to be able to make this change, we have to be able to check it out and verbalise our visions. We have to be able to examine practices without being defensive in order to enable change. And we need to break down the barriers because we're creating an environment where everybody can learn.
So we're going to enable people to create change in organisations by being willing to both challenge and be challenged. And for me, that's part of what makes the role interesting. Being prepared to advocate for the person you're working with. And like Sarah says earlier, prioritising the safety of the person you're working with above and beyond the safety of the institution. And being prepared to go against the institutions and the narratives you want to follow.
We really have begun to see real co-production recently, and there are barriers, but co-production isn't a buzzword. Actually, it's a reality. It's the way we are working at the University of Suffolk. COVID restrictions have honestly created some more barriers, certainly in reduced communications, and initially provided less opportunities for meeting. But actually, social work voices and the social work faculty in Suffolk have worked really hard, and I would say that we're meeting as much, if not more, than we ever did. Historically, the barriers have been that professionals kind of just want service participants to do or say particular things, and service participants haven't really had any or very much autonomy. Some have held biases or been resistant to co-production. This is now honestly seen as a vital part of teaching social work at the University of Suffolk. We've all worked really hard to overcome the barriers, as I said, and social work voices are rapidly becoming an integral part of not just the university, but teaching partnership, the ASYE, the student hubs, and Suffolk County Council. Together we are strong, and we are creating outstanding learning opportunities for professionals and students alike.
We need an openness to learn from other people and be able to put our judgments to one side. We need to not have preconceived notions. Since I was a minor, I don't have any direct personal experience of this from a social worker, but I've heard much about my father's social worker, who was an absolute powerhouse. He basically moved mountains and beat what must have seemed like insurmountable odds to hold my father's priority to recover fully and provide security for me above the prejudice and bias of 1970s Britain. give some background, my dad was taken away to a hospital wing of Brixton Prison, and then he was tried at the Old Bailey, and the verdict was involuntary manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Now, luckily for him and me, that he was under a fairly newly qualified psychiatrist who was eons ahead of his time. And this man actually recently turned down an MBE, I think, because he had some concerns about how things haven't moved on so much. But he was something else. But this social worker, he had a massively positive impact on my life course and my dad's, and the psychiatrist as well. My own example is from a psychiatrist who I consulted regarding withdrawing from medication, having not relapsed for 12 years. This was about 15 years or so ago. By this time, I'd seen scores and scores of psychiatrists, but this doctor really saw me and kind of met me where I was. He had me pegged immediately as a lateral thinker and a bit of a, I don't know, an outside the box type of character. And he referenced Ulysses and suggested that I found a way to tie myself to the mast amidst the storm and the call of the sirens. And he told me that since I was massively sensitive to the medication, that I should crush it into powder so I could reduce it in smaller increments. And that would literally make the toes curl of any of the other psychiatrists that I'd seen. So these were just a few of the suggestions that were completely on my wavelength, offered in the spirit of mutual respect and his absolute regard that I was innately a better expert on myself than he was. And this man, he gave me agency and autonomy to manage my well-being in a way that I couldn't have done had I not had this consultation. His bespoke treatment offered me, empowered me to manage my mental well-being better than any dictatorial professional before him or after him in that field.
Proper co-production, in my experience, takes more time, but the results are better. It is also initially more expensive than traditional ways of working. However, it often proves to be less expensive in the long run because it can result in less reliance on services. When paying people for their involvement, the impact on benefits has been a significant and challenging factor. The university has worked hard to address this with the local welfare rights team and has managed to overcome this. However, it's also important to recognise that not everybody we work with is on benefits.
So realistically, restrictions on budget can limit co-production at times, but the culture's shifting when we share resources, and there really is a greater sharing of resources between institutions, and there's more crossover of learning. A recent training day of professional curiosity that was designed and presented by Nora Duckett of the University of Suffolk and members of Social Work Voices brought professionals from so many different areas of education, health and social work to learn together. It was really amazing. Health and social care need to work together, and the co-productive model allows for this. We need to look toward a cohesive, collaborative, co-productive future between services.
Another barrier is often that there is not a role dedicated to service participant involvement. Research shows that both time and resources are required to achieve this. So often it is added onto someone's full-time lecturing role, which makes it difficult for them to follow up with people after lectures or check in more generally.
Many service participants would like to be more co-productive. Professionally, I have found it surprisingly challenging sometimes to successfully address frequent discrepancies from a stipulated ethos of equality and mutual respect, often having the power of my unique story, perspective and character quashed. Co-production just cannot be an authoritarian approach.
Nope, none of us know it all. Not professionals, not service participants. When working with someone, we all have to approach each situation as though it's brand new. Each person, each experience is unique, and we must all have an open mind to see it. We all bring knowledge and past experience to the table to share, all of us.
We are all responsible for improving social work practice, the students, the academics and the service participants. We are co-producing through the learning, and this is ingrained in the learning. The service participants and students are learning from each other, and the faculty are learning from the service participants. I would like to take this opportunity to thank John and Sarah for their invaluable involvement in this session and for so generously sharing their stories.
And I'm humbled and honoured every time I hear John's story, honestly. And it is hugely generous of you to share it with us, John. And Sophie, John and I would really like to thank you on behalf of us all at Social Work Voices. Your unfailing patience and support, and your confidence and belief and trust in co-production. You're amazing. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you to everybody for listening?
Well, John, I need to say just thank you so much. You've used, all three of you, I think, have used the word privilege tonight, but for us, for all of the people here, it's been just such a privilege. And the chat's been so quiet because people have just been enthralled by what you've said. There's no questions because people, I can just see, you know, people are just sitting there. And we've had so many people saying, you know, I just can see now someone saying this has been one of the best webinars so far. People were talking earlier about I've been attending these webinars since March and I've got so much out of this one and I've learned so much out of this one. So, you know, we're getting, oh, there's a question. Have John or Sarah ever, you see, they've put it in the chat, so I'm missing it, but have you ever written a book? And maybe this is a, you know, a social work voices book would be marvelous. You know, I could just hit, and there's so many quotes. People have been writing down quotes, and a book would be fabulous for them to be able to quote from, you know. So, but there's so many now thanks coming out from the webinar tonight. And I would say, you know, when you said earlier, Sarah, I think you said, and we are strong together and we create some amazing resources, and you've created an amazing webinar tonight. I know how much work you've put into it. You know, I know from us meeting to prepare the session how much you put into it. And just also, you know, Paul was talking in the chat earlier about co-production is also, it's also emotionally challenging for people, and it's emotional labor as well, and we really appreciate all of that you've put in. You know, people are just saying, honestly, it's the best webinar ever. Thank you for your genuineness, your honesty and your humor. And it really was, it's been a fabulous session tonight, so thank you so much. I know we'll meet again afterwards to talk about it and look back on it, but you know, just from our perspective, just feeding back for you what's in the chat, people have found it amazing. And what I really like is you know, these webinars were designed to think about how do we put theory into practice. And I think what you've really done is you've really demonstrated the theory of co-production live in practice tonight. I think it's been a fabulous webinar. So thank you so much to all three of you. I know that the team have all been really quiet as well. Normally there's loads going on in our WhatsApp group. So have you done this with the tech? Have you done that? And there's been nothing tonight. Everyone's just going, this is amazing. So just listening to you has been just really amazing. So thank you very much. I have
Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome, definitely, you know, but there are now questions, and it's always the way we get questions right at the end. But we've got, can we access the training that Sarah and John have done on carers? One person is saying, and do social work voices do training around the country is another question that we have here. And we're also getting lots of comments that they would definitely buy your book if you did a book. So we probably, if I'm honest, haven't got time to answer those questions at this point, but we have said, haven't we, that we can just ask you that and we'll send answers to the questions out in our follow-up email that, you know, everybody knows Diane Kultuna on the team will send out a follow-up email to you all at the weekend, and you'll also get your certificates of attendance at the weekend. So Sophie, if you could just turn us just to the final slide as well, that would be really helpful. So just to let people know, and I think the team will put into the chat now the links for you to register for the next couple of weeks. Next week we're doing another back to basics. We're looking at building a body of theory. It's a new exercise really about looking at how you can think about the theory that you use in your practice. I was really fascinated listening. I was writing loads of things down earlier about, I think it was Sarah who talked about putting things at the heart of your practice, and that's what we're going to be looking at next week. We're going to be looking at what's the heart that keeps your body beating, and we're going to be using that as one of our analogies. So next week's all about back to basics, but it's a great session to look at the theory that you're using in your practice. And then we wanted to alert you early to the fact that on Wednesday the 2nd of June we're going to have an experience which is very much a co-produced webinar, Bang and Your Rights Are Gone, and we're going to be looking at the Samurai social worker is going to return. Those of you who've been for a few weeks will remember him from our recording webinar, and he's going to talk about his experiences of mental health services. It will be a one-time only event. That session will not be on YouTube, because we're going to be talking about some things that are, it's going to be very multisensory, and it's just going to be a one-off event, no YouTube for that one. And then the following week we're going to be joined by Carolyn Aldridge, who's going to share with us quite a lot of learning around her book, which I'm reading at the moment, which is a fascinating book. So please, you know, if you want to register, there the next 3 sessions, and don't forget to everybody that we will have our virtual graduation celebration as well on the 23rd of June, and I'm probably going to come and ask John and Sarah if you'll do something with us for that, but that's all to follow up. So the next few weeks we've got some really good sessions coming up, so look forward to seeing you then. And from my perspective, I just want to say thank you to John, to Sarah and to Sophie, and I'm going to give the final word to you before we do our usual wave to everybody as we close the session. So I don't know what final word you would like to have, and I don't know who wants to have it, but I'm just going to hand over to you to say good night to our audience tonight.
Go on, John. You're the most eloquent of the 3 of us. You're on mute.
You're on mute though, John. we always have to do that at some point in a Zoom meeting. You have to go, you're on mute.
Yeah, that's how eloquent I am. Anyway, I saw some of the chats coming up, and I was very touched by some of the live feedback, and I wish I could kind of respond. So it is such a therapeutic. There's such a therapeutic sense for me about being able to share some of these experiences and just in such a compassionate, empathic audience, and makes me hopeful for, you know, that actually, you know, things are looking up, which they definitely are. So yes, Sarah, you built me up as eloquent there, so I failed you there, but over to you.
Never. You never fail us, John. You were brilliant. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having us. And yes, if you want to access John's training or training that I've done, contact through Sophie, and Social Work Voices would be happy to be invited.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, and good night to everybody, and thanks for coming tonight. Bye.